Forget everything you think you know about the working girl of history. Forget the cinematic saloon prostitute with a heart of gold, leaning over a piano, a single tear rolling down her perfectly made-up cheek. Forget the tragic but beautiful heroine coughing delicately into a silk handkerchief. That's a lie. It's a comfortable, perfumed fantasy we tell ourselves so we don't have to look at the truth. The truth, as it usually is, was far grittier, far more transactional, and infinitely more disgusting. The reality was less about tragic romance and more about the grim calculus of survival, a daily battle fought with carbolic acid douches, mercury-laced salves, and a level of cynical detachment that would make a modern-day corporate raider blush. It was a world of filth, both literal and metaphorical, where a woman's body was a commodity, her emotions a performance, and her future a ticking clock counting down to disease, destitution, or death. Imagine not a saloon, but a crib, a tiny, suffocating room, barely big enough for a bed and a bucket, the air thick with the smell of cheap whiskey, unwashed bodies, and the cloying sweetness of perfume trying and failing to mask the scent of decay. The soundtrack wasn't a mournful piano. It was the rhythmic creaking of a bed frame, the muffled grunt of a paying customer, and the hollow cough that signaled not a cinematic illness, but the slow, grinding progress of consumption or the final stages of syphilis. This wasn't a job for the faint of heart. It was a brutal meat grinder of a profession that took in young women full of desperate hope or just plain desperation and spat out hollowed-out shells, their bodies ravaged and their spirits broken. The men who came to them weren't lovesick cowboys or charming rogues. They were miners, soldiers, and cattlemen, caked in the grime of their labor, carrying their loneliness and their lust like a weapon. They paid their 2 bits or their dollar for a few minutes of friction, a brief, impersonal transaction that left both parties emptier than before. The heart of gold, it was a liability. Any genuine emotion was a weakness to be exploited, a chink in the armor that could lead to ruin. The only thing that mattered was the cash in hand, the next meal, the roof over one's head for another night. But let's not just linger in the dusty, sun-baked misery of the American West. Oh no, we're going somewhere far more sophisticated, far more glamorous, and somehow even more perverse. We're going to Venice, the floating city, the jewel of the Adriatic, a place where prostitution wasn't just a dirty secret hidden in back alleys. It was an art form, a pillar of the economy, and a spectacle of breathtaking hypocrisy. Here, the most successful courtesans weren't just whores, they were celebrities. They were poets, musicians, and intellectuals who commanded fortunes, hobnobbed with cardinals and kings, and were treated, on the surface, like queens. They were the courtigians honestes, the honest courtesans living in opulent palazzos, draped in silk and jewels. But underneath the gilded facade, the fundamental transaction was the same bodily fluids, the same diseases, the same soul-crushing reality of selling intimacy for survival. The only difference was the price tag and the quality of the clientele. The lie was just better dressed. They traded witty couplets and philosophical debates as foreplay, but the end game was always the bed. And for every one of these celebrated, honest courtesans, there were 1,000 of her sisters, the courtigians di lume, the courtesans of the light, named for the lamps they kept burning in their windows. They were the rank and file, the street-level soldiers in Venice's army of pleasure, living and dying in the same squalor as their counterparts across the ocean. The story of the Venetian courtesan is the story of this grotesque duality, this tightrope walk between being treated like a goddess and being treated like trash. It's a story of power, poetry, and poison, of shame and spectacle. It's the ultimate historical example of putting lipstick on a pig and then charging a fortune to kiss it. Sound romantic? It wasn't. It was a masterpiece of exploitation, dressed up in the language of art and love. But before we get down on our knees in these gilded, filthy palazzos, I need to know who's in my congregation of the cynical. Confess in the comments. What patch of holy or unholy ground are you on, and what's the time on your soul's clock? I want to know who's ready to watch the sacred get profane. All right, let's light a candle for the damned. It won't save them. The journey from girl to courtigiana onesta was not a whimsical stumble into a life of luxury. It was a calculated, brutal, and often soul-crushing transformation, a meticulous sculpting of flesh and spirit into a marketable product. This wasn't about learning a trade. It was about erasing a person and building a persona in her place. The process began early, often in adolescence, under the watchful, hawk-like gaze of a mother, an aunt, or a seasoned procuress, the ruffiana, who saw in a pretty face not a daughter, but a long-term investment. This was the pre-ritual, the slow, agonizing preparation for a life of performance. The first and most crucial stage was the assault on the body itself, remaking it to fit an impossible ideal. Hair was a primary obsession. The Venetian ideal was a specific shade of reddish blonde, a color that screamed wealth and artifice. Achieving it was a chemical nightmare. A young girl would have her hair repeatedly slathered in a foul-smelling concoction of roccolum, black sulfur, and honey, or, more commonly, a corrosive mix of lye and acidic, rapontic rhubarb. Then she would be forced to sit for hours in the scorching sun on an altana, a rooftop terrace, wearing a special wide-brimmed, crownless hat called a solana. Her hair would be spread over the brim, exposed to the sun's rays, while her face, protected by the hat, was hopefully spared from freckles and burns. The process was painful, the scalp often burned and blistered, the hair turning brittle and dry. But a perfect unnatural blonde was the goal, a beacon of her manufactured desirability. Then came the skin. The goal was a deathly luminous pallor, a sign that one did not toil in the sun. This was achieved with Venetian ceruse, a thick, white cosmetic paste made from white lead mixed with vinegar. Every morning, this toxic sludge would be smeared across the face, neck, and décolletage, creating a smooth porcelain mask. It was heavy, suffocating, and it cracked if you dared to smile too widely. More insidiously, the lead was absorbed through the skin, leading to a slow, cumulative poisoning. It caused hair loss, muscle paralysis, stomach ailments, and eventually a rotting of the gums and bones. The very substance used to create the illusion of youthful beauty was actively destroying the body beneath. Rouge for the cheeks and lips was made from cochineal, or more dangerously, vermilion, a pigment derived from mercury sulfide. A touch of this poison to feign a healthy blush, a smear of it to create an inviting mouth. Every part of the preparation was a dance with toxins, a trade-off of long-term health for short-term marketability. The physical preparation was matched by an equally rigorous intellectual and artistic grooming. A future courtigiana onesta had to be more than just a beautiful object. She had to be an entertainer, a companion, a living work of art. Her days were a blur of lessons. She learned to play the lute, the viol, or the harpsichord, her fingers calloused from hours of practice. She was taught to sing madrigals, her voice trained to be pleasing and seductive. She was forced to read, not just for pleasure, but for performance. She memorized the works of Petrarch and Boccaccio, learning to recite poetry with feigned passion. She was drilled in rhetoric and conversation, taught how to flatter a nobleman, debate a philosopher, and gently mock a pompous merchant without causing offense. This was not education for its own sake, it was the acquisition of social weaponry. Every memorized sonnet, every gracefully plucked string was another tool in her arsenal, another line item on the bill. The anxiety was a constant companion. The pressure was immense. A slip of the tongue, a poorly played note, a crack in the ceruse mask, any imperfection could devalue the product. The ruffiana was a relentless taskmaster, her approval a rare and precious commodity. A mistake might be met with a slap, a denial of food, or, worst of all, the cold, calculating threat of being thrown out to become a common delumi. The humiliation was woven into the very fabric of this preparation. There were hymenal inspections, crude and invasive examinations, to certify a virginity that could be sold at an exorbitant price. There were lessons in posture, in walking, in sitting, every movement designed to be alluring. There were even lessons in faking pleasure, in moaning convincingly, in arching her back just so. She was being stripped of all spontaneity, all genuine expression, and taught to replace it with a series of well-rehearsed, profitable gestures. This wasn't a young woman blossoming, it was a racehorse being trained, a product being readied for market. The tedious, repetitive, and painful nature of this preparation served a dual purpose. It created the desired commodity, but it also systematically broke down the girl's spirit, replacing her identity with her function. By the time she was ready to be presented to her first patron, she was no longer just a person. She was an exquisite, walking, talking, poison-laced performance, every inch of her, from her bleached hair to her memorized poetry, a testament to the brutal, commodifying logic of her world. The dread was palpable, a constant thrum beneath the surface of the lute music and rhyming couplets. It was the fear of failure, the fear of the first encounter, and the deeper, unspoken fear of what she was becoming. The stage for this elaborate performance of sex and intellect was as crucial as the actress herself. The environment of a successful Venetian courtesan was a carefully curated illusion, a physical manifestation of her manufactured worth. It was a world away from the piss-stenched alleys and cramped cribs of the delumi, yet it was, in its own way, just as much a prison. The home of a cortigiana onesta was often a palazzo, or at least a lavish apartment within one, situated in a respectable, though not quite noble, part of the city. From the outside, it was just another elegant Venetian facade, its plaster walls painted in shades of terracotta or ochre, its Gothic windows looking out over a canal. But inside it was a theatre of seduction. The architectural details were chosen for maximum effect. Guests would enter a grand reception room, a salone, with high timbered ceilings and floors of polished terrazzo, a mosaic of marble chips that gleamed in the candlelight. The walls would be covered not in wallpaper but in rich, heavy fabrics, velvet or silk damask in deep crimsons and golds, which absorbed sound and created an intimate, womb-like atmosphere. This wasn't just decoration, it was acoustic engineering designed to make conversation feel private and conspiratorial. The furniture was a collection of props. A large ornate harpsichord or a delicate lute would be prominently displayed, not just as instruments, but as symbols of her artistic prowess. Bookshelves would be filled with leather-bound volumes of Petrarch, Ovid, and Aretino, advertising her literacy and wit. The chairs were plush, upholstered in expensive fabrics designed for lounging and long, drunken conversations. The sensory atmosphere was intoxicating by design, a carefully mixed cocktail of opulence and decay. The air was thick with the scent of expensive imported perfumes, musk, civet, and ambergris, mingling with the smoke from beeswax candles, a luxury far beyond the tallow candles of the poor. The smell was designed to be overwhelming, to mask the ever-present stench of the canals that wafted in through the windows, a constant reminder of the filth upon which this beauty was built. You'd hear the gentle lapping of water against the building's foundations, the distant cry of a gondolier. But inside, the dominant sounds were the courtesan's own creations, the soft strains of a lute, a practiced laugh, the murmur of recited poetry. The light was always dim, always flattering. During the day, heavy drapes would filter the harsh sunlight into a soft glow. At night, dozens of candles and oil lamps would cast a flickering golden light, a forgiving radiance that hid the cracks in the ceruse, the weariness in the eyes, and the subtle signs of age or disease. It was the original soft focus lens, a cinematographer's trick to enhance the fantasy. But this opulent stage had a backstage, a grim reality hidden behind a tapestry or a locked door. This was where the tools of the trade were kept. The bedroom itself was a paradox. The bed would be a magnificent four-poster, draped in silk and piled high with feather pillows, a throne for the nightly performance. But beside it, or in a small adjoining chamber, lay the ugly truth. Here you would find the chamber pot, its contents to be unceremoniously dumped into the canal under the cover of darkness. Here was the basin and ewer for the ritualistic, post-coital washing. And here were the real tools, sponges tied with a string for retrieval, soaked in vinegar or lemon juice to be used as crude and largely ineffective contraceptive pessaries. There were syringes made of metal or glass for douching, filled with astringent solutions of wine or infusions of herbs, a painful and often damaging attempt to wash away the evidence of the transaction and prevent disease. You'd find the pots of Venetian ceruse and the mercury-based rouge, the poisons that maintained the mask. And in a small hidden box you might find the most terrifying tool of all, a vial of mercury chloride, the go-to cure for syphilis. This was not for ingestion but for topical application, a caustic treatment that burned the sores but did little to halt the disease's relentless march through the body. The environment was a perfect metaphor for the courtesan's life. The public spaces, the salone, were a testament to her success, a stage set for her power. They screamed culture, wealth, and desirability. This was the part of her life that patrons paid for, the illusion of consorting with a goddess of art and love. But the private spaces, the hidden closets and back rooms told a different story. They were clinical, desperate, and dangerous. They smelled not of perfume but of chemicals, acid, and fear. The contrast between the public opulence and the private squalor was the ultimate power dynamic. The patron experienced only the fantasy, the carefully constructed world of beauty and wit. The courtesan lived in both, constantly moving between the stage and the grimy backstage, her entire existence a performance built on a foundation of hidden filth and secret pain. The beautiful palazzo wasn't a home, it was a factory for producing a very specific kind of male fantasy, and its most important machine was the woman who lived inside it. In this glittering, rotting city, power was not held by a single king or emperor. It was a fluid, treacherous current flowing between three great institutions, the state, the church, and the patriarchy. For the Venetian courtesan, these were not abstract concepts. They were the authority figures who defined the boundaries of her cage, profited from her labor, and held the power of her ruin in their hands. They were a hydra-headed master, each head smiling with a different kind of hypocrisy. First, there was the Venetian Republic itself, the Serenissima. The state was not a moral crusader, it was a pragmatic, ruthless business manager. The government recognized that a city full of sailors, merchants, soldiers, and wealthy tourists needed a release valve for its lusts. Prostitution was not just tolerated, it was a state-sanctioned, state-regulated, and state-taxed industry. The courtesans, particularly the successful ones, were walking, talking assets to the Venetian economy. They drew in wealthy foreigners who would spend lavishly on lodging, food, and gifts, all of which fueled the city's coffers. The state's power was wielded through bureaucracy and regulation. The health office, the Magistrato alla Sanità, kept registers of prostitutes, ostensibly for public health reasons, but really for control. They dictated where certain classes of prostitutes could live and work, forcing the lower-tier dailume into designated red-light districts like the castelletto. They imposed rules like the infamous law requiring courtesans to wear yellow scarves or handkerchiefs to distinguish them from honorable women, a public badge of their profession that was both a mark of shame and a form of advertisement. The state's hypocrisy was staggering. It profited from the very trade it publicly regulated for decency. It would tax a courtesan's earnings while simultaneously passing laws that limited her property rights. They saw her as a necessary evil, a taxable commodity, and a useful tool for keeping social order, but never, ever as a citizen with rights. The state was her pimp, and it was the biggest, most powerful pimp in the city. Then there was the church, a monolithic presence whose bells punctuated every hour of the Venetian day. Its authority was absolute, and its condemnation of sex work was thunderous. From the pulpits of St. Mark's Basilica and every local parish, priests and bishops railed against the sin of carnality, painting prostitutes as gateways to hell, Jezebels leading righteous men to damnation. They preached of eternal fire and divine punishment, creating a pervasive atmosphere of guilt and fear that seeped into the soul of every woman in the trade. A courtesan might be witty and cynical with her clients, but she was still a product of her time, and the fear of God's wrath was very real. Yet the Church's moral outrage was a spectacular performance of double-dealing. While publicly condemning the courtesans, its highest-ranking officials were among their most enthusiastic and lucrative clients. Cardinals, bishops, and wealthy abbots, sworn to celibacy, would slip through the city's canals under the cover of darkness to seek the company of the very women they damned from the pulpit. They would enjoy the fruits of sin in the private palazzos, debating philosophy and enjoying carnal pleasures before returning to their holy duties the next morning. This was the ultimate power play, the ability to define an act as a mortal sin and then indulge in it without consequence. For the courtesan, this made the Church a terrifyingly schizophrenic authority. It was a source of profound psychological torment and at the same time a major source of income. It was the institution that could have her tried for witchcraft by the Inquisition and the institution whose princes paid her bills. Finally, there was the overarching power of the patriarchy, the web of male patrons who were the courtesan's immediate overlords. These were the wealthy merchants, the visiting nobles, the foreign dignitaries. Her entire existence depended on their whims. A powerful patron could elevate her, showering her with gifts, introducing her to influential circles, and securing her reputation. His favor meant security, luxury, and a degree of power. But this favor was fickle. A patron could drop her in an instant for a younger, newer face. He could refuse to pay, leaving her with no legal recourse. He could become violent, his wealth and status protecting him from any consequences. He could spread rumors that would destroy her reputation and her livelihood. The power dynamic in the bedroom was a microcosm of the societal one. The courtesan might use her wit and her wiles to create the illusion of control, to make the man feel he was the one being seduced. But both of them knew who was really in charge. He was the one with the money, the one with the social standing, the one who could walk away. She was the one who had to please, who had to perform, whose survival depended on his satisfaction. These three authorities, the pragmatic state, the hypocritical church, and the powerful male clientele, formed the gilded bars of the courtesan's cage. They were her employers, her regulators, her moral judges, and her customers. They were all in a symbiotic, parasitic relationship with her, feeding off her while defining the terms of her existence. Her life was a constant, exhausting negotiation with these masters, a desperate attempt to find a sliver of agency in a world designed to deny her any. Before the first touch, before the first negotiated price, there was a vast, unseen battleground: the mind. To understand the Venetian courtesan and her client, you have to wade into the murky swamp of their internal world, a bizarre cocktail of devout faith, terrifying folk medicine, and tortured psychological justification. This was the software running on the hardware of their bodies, dictating every move, every fear, and every rationalization. For the courtesan, the Catholic faith was both a source of profound terror and a strange, flexible tool. On one hand, she was acutely aware that her entire profession was built on the foundation of mortal sin. The threat of eternal damnation was not a metaphor, it was a terrifyingly real possibility. She would hear the fire and brimstone sermons, see the gruesome depictions of hell in church frescoes, and feel a genuine pang of fear for her immortal soul. Many courtesans were outwardly devout, attending Mass, often in segregated seating, praying to the Virgin Mary for protection, and giving generously to the Church, as if they could buy a spiritual indulgence to offset their nightly sins. It was a desperate hedge against hellfire. Yet, on the other hand, a sophisticated cortigiana honesta learned to twist theology to her advantage. During the Renaissance, a revival of Neoplatonic philosophy was in vogue among the educated elite. This school of thought proposed that physical beauty was a reflection of divine beauty, and that physical love could be a stepping stone to a higher spiritual love of God. A clever courtesan would co-opt this language. She could frame the sexual act not as a sordid transaction, but as a divine union, a meeting of beautiful souls ascending to a higher plane. It was, of course, magnificent bullshit, but it was well-dressed, philosophical bullshit that allowed her client to feel like he wasn't just paying for sex. He was engaging in a profound aesthetic and spiritual experience. It elevated the transaction, gave it a veneer of intellectual respectability, and, most importantly, allowed everyone to feel better about what was really happening. It was the ultimate psychological justification. This isn't sin, it's philosophy. The world of folk medicine and superstition was even more pervasive and terrifying. The understanding of the human body was a landscape of horrors. Conception was a mysterious and unpredictable event, thought to be influenced by the alignment of the stars, the passion of the encounter, or the woman's own humors. An unwanted pregnancy was a catastrophe, and the remedies were a nightmare. Women would drink concoctions of pennyroyal, rue, or savin, toxic herbs that could induce abortion, but could just as easily induce convulsions and death. They would engage in violent physical activity, hoping to dislodge the seed. Every missed menstrual cycle was a period of sheer panic. Then there was the terror of disease, particularly syphilis, the Great Pox, which was rampant and untreatable. Superstition governed prevention. Some believed wearing certain amulets could ward off infection. Others clung to the idea that disease only struck the unclean, a belief that fueled obsessive and often harmful douching rituals. The prevailing medical theory of the four humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, dictated that illness was caused by an imbalance. A courtesan feeling unwell might be subjected to bloodletting by a back-alley surgeon, weakening her further. She might be prescribed diets or purges based on these pre-scientific beliefs, all of them useless against the spirochete drilling its way through her system. For the male client, the internal monologue was a different kind of justification. The nobleman or wealthy merchant saw the courtesan not as a person, but as a luxury good, a status symbol, no different from his fine horse or his silk waistcoat. Being seen with a famous courtesan, being able to afford her, was a public declaration of his wealth, taste, and virility. He rationalized the encounter as his right, a privilege earned by his station. He was a patron of the arts, and she was his living, breathing art piece. The religious hypocrisy ran deep in him, too. He could listen to a sermon condemning prostitutes on Sunday morning and then hire one on Sunday night, compartmentalizing his piety and his lust. He might confess his sin to a priest, perhaps another of the courtesan's clients, receive his penance, and feel his slate wiped clean, ready to sin again. It was a spiritual revolving door. For both parties, there was a necessary psychological detachment. The courtesan had to separate her body from herself. This is not me, she would have to think. This is a role I am playing. The body that he touches is not my soul. This detachment was her primary defense mechanism, the wall she built to protect whatever core of her identity remained. It was a source of great strength, but also profound loneliness. The client, too, had to detach. He had to see her not as a woman with fears, hopes, and a family, but as an object, a service provider. To acknowledge her full humanity would be to acknowledge the squalid reality of the transaction and his role in her exploitation. It was easier to believe the fantasy, to see her as the witty, willing goddess of pleasure she pretended to be. This complex web of belief, sincere faith clashing with cynical rationalization, scientific ignorance breeding superstitious terror, was the invisible stage on which the drama unfolded. It was a world where a woman could pray to the Virgin Mary for help conceiving a lie about Neoplatonic love, all while fearing that the lemon sponge inside her wouldn't prevent a pregnancy that would ruin her, or that the mercury salve on her sores wouldn't stop the pox from eating her brain. It was a psychological minefield, and they walked it every single night. The performance begins. The first point of contact in the world of the cortigiana onesta was rarely a crude, physical overture. It was a carefully choreographed dance of wit and power, a verbal duel that was as much a part of the transaction as the eventual act of sex. But beneath the polished surface of poetry and pleasantries, the initial meeting was a moment of shocking appraisal, a brutal and silent calculation of worth, desire, and danger. Imagine the scene. The patron arrives, not bursting through the door like a ruffian, but announced, stepping from his gondola into the soft, flattering candlelight of the courtesan's salone. He is a man of immense power, a senator, a foreign ambassador, perhaps even a cardinal in secular disguise. He is draped in velvet and fur, the scent of his own expensive cologne mingling with the musk in the air. He sees her, the famous courtesan, posed like a painting, lute in hand, a book of Petrarch open on a nearby table. The illusion is perfect. It's a meeting of equals, a gathering of the beautiful and the powerful. This is the lie they both agree to inhabit. The first contact is verbal. Her voice, trained and melodic, offers a witty greeting, a clever compliment about his attire, or a line of poetry that is both flattering and flirtatious. He responds in kind, showcasing his own education and status. This is the foreplay of the elite. They are sizing each other up. She is assessing his generosity, his mood, his level of intoxication. Is he a connoisseur who will appreciate her performance, or a bore who just wants to get to the end? She listens to the nuances of his speech, looking for tells, a slurring of words that signals too much wine, a cruel edge to his humor that hints at a violent temper. Her mind is a ledger calculating the potential profit against the potential risk. He, in turn, is appraising his purchase. He looks at the famous face, rendered porcelain by the lead-based ceruse. Is it as flawless as the rumors say? He studies her figure, concealed but suggested by the fine silk of her gown. He judges her wit. Is she as clever as her reputation suggests? Is the product worth the high price he is about to pay? It is a silent, ruthless quality check. The first shock often comes when this polished facade cracks. The powerful senator, a man who commands legions and decides the fate of nations, might have terrible breath, a foul miasma of rotting teeth, and stale wine that cuts through the heavy perfume. The visiting duke, famed for his eloquent letters, might have a wet, slobbering laugh and greedy, restless hands that don't respect the slow, rehearsed pace of the seduction. This is the initial intrusion of the grubby, physical reality into the pristine, intellectual fantasy. The shock is hers to manage. Her face must not register disgust. Her body must not flinch from the unwelcome touch. Her training kicks in. She must deflect with a smile, redirect with a witty remark, and maintain the illusion that this slobbering, foul-breathed man is the most charming creature she has ever encountered. The negotiation of price is the next critical moment, the point where the poetry stops and the commerce begins. This is never done crudely. It is a dance of euphemism, often handled through the ruffiana, the mother or procuress, who acts as the business manager. But the terms are understood. A gift for your poetry, he might say, offering a purse heavy with ducats. Her acceptance is the signing of the contract. The weight of that purse dictates the length and nature of the performance to come. A light purse might buy an evening of conversation and a chaste kiss. A heavy one buys the entire night, the complete illusion of love and devotion. The first physical touch is the point of no return. It is almost never a passionate embrace. It is a slow, deliberate gesture, freighted with meaning. He might take her hand to lead her from the salona towards the bedroom. In that touch, all the abstract power dynamics become terrifyingly real. His grip, is it gentle or bruising? His skin, is it smooth or coarse? His touch is the first claim of ownership. For her, this is the moment the mental wall goes up. The person, the soul, retreats, and the body, the commodity, takes over. The shock for him can be just as jarring. He may have spent weeks fantasizing about this perfect, goddess-like creature, but now, up close, the reality is different. The ceruse on her skin feels chalky and cold, not like real flesh. The perfume, so alluring from a distance, is cloying and thick up close. He might see a small crack in the makeup near her eye, revealing the tired human skin beneath. He might feel the rigid tension in her body as he touches her, a subtle stiffening that betrays the performance. The illusion of the willing, passionate lover is punctured by the reality of the professional at work. This initial phase is where all control is lost, where the carefully constructed fantasies of both parties collide with the clumsy, awkward, smelly reality of two human bodies. The witty banter gives way to the rustle of clothing, the intellectual foreplay to the mechanics of the physical act. The shock isn't about violence or overt cruelty, not yet. It's the shock of the mundane, the intrusion of the grubby, imperfect real world into a space that was meant to be a perfect fantasy. It's the silent, mutual acknowledgement that the beautiful play is over and the grim transactional work is about to begin. Once the initial awkward contract of flesh and coin is sealed, the evening descends into the true business of the night, the grinding chaos of the performance. This isn't a whirlwind of passion, it's a long, arduous slog, a marathon of emotional and physical labor designed to simulate an experience that is anything but real. This is where the courtesan truly earns her exorbitant fee, not in a few moments of physical release, but in the hours of sustained, soul-crushing artifice. The midpoint of the encounter is a swamp of intimacy, a close-up, grotesquely detailed tableau of feigned desire. Let's start with the conversation, the intellectual veneer that separates the honesta from her street-level sisters. The client, often drunk and self-important, wants to be seen, to be heard, to be admired. So she listens. For hours, she listens to his boasts about business deals, his complaints about his wife, his half-baked philosophical musings. She must appear enraptured. Her eyes must be wide with feigned fascination. She must laugh at his jokes, even the stupid, cruel ones. She must nod thoughtfully at his pronouncements, no matter how banal. It's the work of a therapist, a sycophant, and a hostage, all rolled into one. Every moment is a calculation. Is he getting bored? Recite a sonnet. Does his ego need stroking? Compare him favorably to a hero from Ovid. Is he becoming maudlin? Play a lively tune on the lute. It's a constant, draining tap dance on the edge of a man's fragile ego. The physical act itself, when it finally arrives, is rarely the cinematic crescendo. It is often a clumsy, sweaty, and profoundly unerotic affair. We must zoom in past the silk sheets and flickering candlelight to the anatomical reality. Imagine the oppressive weight of another body, the stale wine on his breath hot against her cheek. Imagine the scrape of his unshaven chin against the delicate skin of her neck, a skin she must pretend is quivering with pleasure and not with revulsion. Her body, a highly trained instrument, goes through the motions. The arch of the back, the tilt of the head, the soft moan that is perfectly timed to his movements. All are rehearsed, all are for sale. It is a silent, physical monologue of lies. She is acutely aware of every detail, the smell of his sweat mingling with her perfume, creating a sickly sweet odor of manufactured intimacy. The sound of his labored breathing, the wet, rhythmic slap of skin on skin, the creaking of the expensive bed frame. These are the acoustics of her workplace. She feels his fumbling hands, sometimes gentle, sometimes bruising, exploring her body as if it were a new territory to be conquered. Her mind is elsewhere. While her body performs pleasure, her brain is a frantic accountant. She's thinking about the leaky roof the ducats from this night will fix. She's worrying about the cough that has lingered for a month. She's mentally composing a scathing poem about this very man, a secret act of rebellion she will never dare to share. She is a ghost in her own machine, watching the scene from a great, cold distance. The close-up details are what reveal the horror. The Ceruse makeup, softened by sweat, might smear onto the velvet pillows, leaving a ghostly white stain. A small sore on her lip, cleverly hidden by rouge, begins to throb with pain. She focuses on the mechanics of it all, the friction and the fluid, reducing it to a biological process to strip it of any emotional power. She is an expert in the geography of the male ego, knowing just what to say, just how to touch, to bring the transaction to its required conclusion as efficiently as possible. What if the client is impotent? This is a common and dangerous scenario. His failure becomes her fault. She must deploy every tool in her arsenal, flattery, exotic techniques, learned from manuals or other women, a performance of overwhelming desire designed to coax his body into cooperation. Her own frustration or boredom must be ruthlessly suppressed. His shame can easily curl into rage, and a rageful patron is a violent one. The chaos is not always violent. Often, it's just absurd. A wealthy merchant might demand she dress in a specific, bizarre costume. A philosopher might insist on debating the nature of the soul mid-coitus. A foreign diplomat might have hygiene habits that are profoundly alien and disgusting to her. She is a performer, and the script changes with every customer. She must be an actress, a nurse, a psychologist, and an athlete all at once. This sustained slog is the true heart of the courtesan's work. It is not the brief, final spasm of release that defines her night. It is the long, grinding hours of pretending. It's the intimate performance for a man she may despise, the feigning of an emotional connection that is a commercial fiction. It's the deep, bone-wearying exhaustion that comes from holding a perfect, smiling mask in place while your soul is screaming. It's the slow ooze of selfhood, draining away with every fake moan and every paid-for smile. This is the grotesque intimacy of the trade, the slow-motion horror that no romantic painting ever dares to capture. No matter how skilled the performance, no matter how opulent the setting, the carefully constructed world of the courtesan was built on a foundation of risk. Sooner or later, things were guaranteed to go wrong. The downfall was not a matter of if, but when, and it rarely came in a dramatic, operatic blaze of glory. More often, it was a slow, humiliating slide into irrelevance, or a sudden, anticlimactic disaster that revealed the precariousness of her entire existence. The most common failure was economic. A courtesan's career was a frantic race against time, a desperate attempt to accumulate enough wealth to survive before her primary asset, her youth and beauty, faded. This plan almost always failed. A patron, her main source of income, might lose his fortune, die suddenly, or simply grow bored. The flow of ducats would dry up overnight. She might make a bad investment based on a patron's foolish advice, or, most commonly, her earnings would be siphoned away by her family, or her ruffiana, the very people who were supposed to be her support system. She would live a life of apparent luxury, draped in jewels and silks, yet possess very little actual capital. The downfall was finding herself at 35, her face showing the first telltale signs of age that no amount of lead ceruse could hide, with younger, fresher competition flooding the market, and realizing her gilded cage was empty. The humiliation was profound. She would have to sell her fine clothes, her loot, her books. She might move from her grand palazzo to a smaller, shabbier apartment. Her former high-ranking clients would no longer answer her letters. The descent from celebrated honesta to a desperate, forgotten woman scrambling for any client she could find was a well-trodden path. It was a quiet, private bankruptcy of body and soul. Then there was the inevitable betrayal of the body itself, disease and pregnancy. An unwanted pregnancy was a professional catastrophe. It meant months out of work, a body altered, and a future burdened with a child who would be a constant, living reminder of her trade. The attempts to terminate a pregnancy were a gamble with death. If she failed and carried the child to term, the baby was often sent to an orphanage or raised by relatives, a secret shame to be hidden away. The emotional toll of this separation was a silent, festering wound. But the great slow-motion downfall was syphilis. The great pox was the occupational hazard that terrified every woman in the trade. The initial appearance of a painless chancre might be ignored or mistaken for something else, but the disease was a patient monster. The secondary stage would bring fevers, rashes, and oozing sores that could not be hidden by makeup. This was often the point a courtesan's career ended. No man would knowingly pay for a diseased woman. The so-called cures were a horror show in themselves. The primary treatment was mercury, administered as an ointment, a steam bath, or even ingested. The mercury would cause profuse salivation, loose teeth, foul breath, and neurological damage. A woman undergoing the salivation cure was a grotesque spectacle, drooling uncontrollably, her body racked with tremors. She was effectively trading a slow death from syphilis for a slightly faster, more agonizing death from heavy metal poisoning. The downfall was looking in the mirror and seeing not the celebrated beauty, but the ravaged mask of the pox, the collapsed saddle nose as the cartilage rotted away, the bald patches where hair had fallen out, the scars from weeping sores. Humiliation was often public and deliberate. A powerful client, feeling slighted, could orchestrate a public shaming. He might denounce her from the steps of a church, accusing her of theft or of giving him a disease he likely gave to her. He could use his influence to have her officially censured by the city magistrates, her name entered into a public record of disgrace. The ultimate public humiliation was an accusation of witchcraft, a charge that often stuck to intelligent, independent women who seemed to have an unnatural power over men. A trial before the Inquisition was the final, terrifying stop, her wit and poetry useless against accusations of consorting with demons. But often the end was just pathetically anticlimactic. A courtesan didn't always fall. Sometimes she just fizzled out. The conversations became harder to maintain, the jokes less funny, the feigned pleasure more obviously a chore. She became boring. The spark that had made her a star was extinguished by years of emotional labor and physical toll. Patrons simply stopped coming. The silence in the once bustling salon was the sound of her career ending. There was no grand exit, no tragic final act. Just an empty room, a pile of unpaid bills, and the dawning, horrific realization that she was no longer a valuable commodity. She was just a woman, alone, aging and poor, in a city that only valued the young and the beautiful. This was the most common downfall of all, not a bang, but a long, whimpering fade into obscurity and destitution. In a system designed for total subjugation, where a woman's body and soul were line items in a ledger, pure victimhood seems the only possible narrative. But that denies the gritty, stubborn spark of human agency. Even within this gilded cage, courtesans found ways to resist, to push back, to assert their humanity. These were not grand rebellions or organized movements. They were small, often futile acts of defiance, tiny victories in a war they were destined to lose. These moments of resistance make the eventual failure all the more tragic, because they show a spirit fighting to survive, not just a body submitting to its fate. The most potent form of resistance was intellectual and artistic. The poetry of a woman like Veronica Franco was not just a charming parlor trick, it was a weapon. In her published verses, she turned the tables on her male patrons and the hypocritical society that judged her. She wrote about the foolishness of men, their vanity, their broken promises, and their pathetic performance in bed. She exposed the double standard that allowed men to pursue pleasure without shame, while condemning the women who provided it. When she wrote, "When we too are armed and trained, we can convince men that we have hands and feet and a heart like yours," it wasn't a plea, it was a declaration. She was using the very tools they demanded she learn, literacy, rhetoric, wit, to dissect and critique them. This was an incredibly brave act. Publishing her work, entering the male-dominated world of letters, was a form of profound defiance. It was a way of saying, "You may buy my body, but you do not own my mind, and my mind finds you ridiculous." Subtle, daily sabotage was another common tactic. This was the resistance of the less famous, the women without a publishing deal. It could be as simple as giving a deliberately bad experience to a hated client, being cold, clumsy, or accidentally spilling wine on his expensive doublet. It was a risky game, as a complaint could ruin her, but it was a small way to reclaim a sliver of power. Stealing was also rampant. A courtesan might deftly lift a few extra coins from a drunken patron's purse or pocket a small piece of jewelry. It was a quiet rebalancing of the scales, a self-administered bonus for services rendered under duress. These women formed secret networks, informal sisterhoods of survival. They would share information about clients, who was generous, who was violent, who carried the telltale signs of the pox. This was a vital intelligence network that could literally save a woman's life. In the quiet moments between clients, two courtesans might share a bottle of wine and a moment of cynical, gallows humor, bonding over the shared absurdity and horror of their lives. This camaraderie, this shared understanding, was a powerful act of resistance against a system that sought to isolate them and pit them against each other in competition. Occasionally, a customer would have his own crisis of conscience, and this could be manipulated. A man, perhaps young and naive, might become disgusted by the transactional reality of the encounter and refuse to go through with it. A clever courtesan could turn this to her advantage, playing the part of the tragic, sensitive soul, eliciting his pity and securing payment for the emotional damage of the aborted encounter. She could sell him a different kind of fantasy, the fantasy of being her compassionate savior, even if just for one night. But what about a true escape? The attempt to leave the life was the ultimate act of resistance, and it almost always failed. A woman might try to save enough money to buy a small shop, to enter a convent, or to assemble a dowry to marry a respectable artisan. But the system was designed to keep her trapped. The ruffiana, or her family, would claim her savings to pay back the debt of her upbringing and training. A violent pimp or patron might track her down and drag her back. And even if she did get away, the stigma of her past would follow her. Society had no place for a retired whore. The doors of respectable life were firmly bolted. The most tragic act of defiance was an emotional crack, a moment when the professional mask slipped. It could be a flash of genuine rage at a cruel remark, a flicker of pity for a particularly pathetic client, or a sudden, overwhelming wave of disgust that made her physically recoil. These moments were dangerous as they shattered the illusion the client was paying for. But they were also profoundly human. They were proof that beneath the layers of ceruse, cynicism and performance, there was still a person who felt, who hurt, and who, for a brief, uncontrolled second, refused to pretend anymore. These small, failed resistances are the most heartbreaking part of the story. They show that these women were not passive dolls. They fought, they schemed, they wrote, they stole, and they supported each other. They tried to carve out a space for their own humanity in a world that saw them as nothing more than beautiful, disposable objects. Their failure was not a sign of weakness, but a testament to the overwhelming, crushing power of the system they were up against. Just when the sordid routine of sex, money, and disease seemed to have settled into a predictable, miserable rhythm, the world would throw in a wild card. In the life of a Venetian courtesan, escalation was a constant threat, a random element that could suddenly transform her precarious existence into a waking nightmare. These were the moments that ripped away the last vestiges of the glamorous facade, revealing the raw terror and bizarre absurdity simmering just beneath the surface. The ultimate wildcard was the Holy Inquisition. While the Church's princes might be her best clients, the Church's ideological police were her worst nightmare. An accusation of witchcraft or heresy, often leveled by a spurned lover, a business rival, or a moralizing zealot, could bring a courtesan before the dreaded tribunal. Suddenly, her intelligence and wit, the very qualities that made her a successful Honesta, became evidence against her. Could she read and write? Suspicious for a woman. Did she use folk remedies for contraception or health? Clearly demonic potions. Did she seem to have an unnatural power to bewitch powerful men? Proof of a pact with Satan. Veronica Franco herself was subjected to this ordeal in 1580. Imagine the scene. The celebrated poet and lover of nobles dragged into a dark stone chamber, facing grim-faced inquisitors in black robes. They didn't ask about her poetry. They asked if she performed magical rituals, if she cast spells, if she conjured demons in her bedroom. The threat of torture was ever present. The rack, the thumbscrews, the strappado, tools designed to extract a confession, true or not. Franco, in a testament to her incredible courage and intellect, defended herself brilliantly and was acquitted, but most were not so lucky. An accusation was often as good as a conviction. The escalation from a luxurious palazzo to a damp, rat-infested prison cell, from witty banter to screaming under torture, was a terrifyingly real possibility. It was the system turning on its own, the hypocritical authorities deciding to make an example of one of their favorite playthings. Another devastating escalation was the arrival of the plague. Venice, a bustling port city, was a gateway for pestilence. When the Black Death swept through, as it did periodically and catastrophically, it was the great equalizer. The disease didn't distinguish between a duchess and a whore. Suddenly, the carefully maintained social order collapsed into chaos. Patrons who once paid a fortune for a night of pleasure were now just terrified bodies, their faces covered with the telltale buboes. The city became a charnel house. Gondolas that once carried lovers now carried corpses to be dumped on plague islands. For a courtesan, this was an apocalyptic shift. Her business vanished overnight. Her clients were either dead, dying, or fled. Her beauty and wit were useless against an invisible enemy. The fear of contagion was everywhere. A cough, a fever, a slight rash, all were potential death sentences. The city's authorities, overwhelmed, would implement brutal quarantines, locking people in their homes to die. The gilded cage became a literal tomb. In this new reality, a courtesan's survival skills had to adapt. She was no longer selling sex, she was trying to avoid death. The beautiful palazzo, once a symbol of her success, was now just a place to starve, isolated and alone. Then there were the more personal, bizarre escalations. A wealthy, eccentric patron might develop an obsession that went beyond the usual commercial transaction. He might begin to stalk her, his love turning into a possessive, dangerous mania. He might demand exclusivity, trying to lock her away from other clients, effectively turning her from a high-earning independent contractor into his private prisoner. This was a terrifying reversal of fortune, stripping her of her income and her limited freedom. Sometimes the wild card was an unexpected arrival. A patron's wife, discovering her husband's infidelity, might appear at the courtesan's door, not to fight, but to beg for her husband back, a humiliating and surreal encounter for both women. Or worse, the wife might send her brothers or cousins to deliver a message of violence, a beating in a dark alley to punish the harlot who had tempted her husband, or consider the arrival of a new, powerful political faction in Venice. A shift in the city's leadership could lead to a sudden crackdown on decadence. The new regime, eager to prove its moral fiber, might launch a crusade against prostitution. Old, unenforced laws would be revived. The yellow scarves would be mandatory again. Raids on palazzos would become common. A courtesan who had built her career on the favor of the old guard would find herself a target of the new. These wild-card elements served as a constant, brutal reminder. She had no real control. Her success, her safety, her very life was subject to the whims of disease, religion, and politics. She was a beautiful ship sailing on a treacherous sea, and a storm could appear on the horizon at any moment, without warning, ready to smash her to pieces against the rocks. The escalation was the moment the game's rules changed arbitrarily, and she was always on the losing side. The performance is over. The patron, his lust sated and his ego sufficiently stroked, has stumbled out into the pre-dawn gloom, leaving behind a scene of quiet devastation. The immediate aftermath in the courtesan's palazzo is not a moment of peaceful slumber, but a period of grim, methodical triage. This is the cleanup, the accounting, and the hollow silence after the storm, a grotesque landscape painted in shades of exhaustion and disgust. The first sense to engage is smell. The air, once thick with expensive perfume and incense, is now stale and rank. It's a foul cocktail of spilled wine, the animalic scent of sweat and sex, the lingering odor of the patron's bad breath, and the faint, chemical tang of the lead makeup. It is the smell of the transaction, stripped of all its romantic artifice. The room itself is a wreck. The magnificent bed, the stage for the night's main event, is a tangle of stained and rumpled sheets, silk and linen smeared with sweat, wine, perhaps even blood. A ghost of her white ceruse makeup might be imprinted on a dark velvet pillow. An overturned goblet has left a dark, spreading stain on a priceless rug. A book of poetry lies on the floor, its spine broken, knocked from a table in a moment of clumsy passion. It's a scene of violation, the careful order of her curated space disrupted by the brute force of the encounter. This is the moment the courtesan is truly alone, and the work begins. First, the accounting. Before anything else, she finds the purse he left. Her fingers, perhaps still aching from playing the lute for hours, untie the leather string. She counts the coins, her mind a cold, hard ledger. Was it the agreed-upon amount? Did he shortchange her? Or was he generous in his drunken satisfaction? This moment is the rawest distillation of the night. Her performance of sublime, intellectual love is reduced to a pile of gold and silver ducats. This is her salary. This is her worth. Comes the triage of the body. Her own flesh feels alien, a bruised and overused tool. She drags her exhausted limbs to a basin of cold water. The first shock of the water on her skin is a small, sharp penance. She begins the ritual of cleaning, a desperate attempt to wash away the night. She scrubs at her skin, trying to remove the feel of his hands, the residue of his sweat. The most critical part of this cleanup is internal, the douching. Using a metal or glass syringe, she flushes her insides with a harsh, astringent mixture, vinegar, lemon juice, wine, or an herbal infusion. It's a painful, invasive process, a scouring of her innermost self. It's a medically dubious attempt to prevent pregnancy and disease, but it's also a powerful psychological ritual. It is an act of purification, an attempt to cleanse not just the physical remnants of the man, but the spiritual stain of the encounter itself. She must then deal with her face, the mask of her trade. She uses a cloth soaked in oil or another concoction to painstakingly wipe away the layers of Venetian ceruse. As the thick, white paste comes off, it reveals the woman beneath, the tired eyes, the faint lines of stress, the red patches of irritated skin. It is a moment of painful vulnerability, seeing her real face in the mirror, a face no client is ever allowed to see. It is the face of a worker at the end of a long, hard shift. Then there is the looting of the leftovers. She gathers the empty wine bottles. She checks to see if the patron left behind anything of value, a glove, a handkerchief, a small trinket. Anything left behind is forfeit, a small, undeclared bonus. She straightens the room, picking up the fallen book, righting the overturned chair, smoothing the ruined bed sheets as best she can. She is a stagehand, resetting the scene for the next performance. The emotional landscape is a hollowed-out crater. The adrenaline of the performance has faded, leaving behind a profound, bone-deep weariness that is more than just physical. It is a spiritual exhaustion. There is no elation, no satisfaction. There is only the quiet, humming emptiness of a transaction completed. In this silence, the fears creep back in. The fears. Did he carry the pox? Was the contraceptive sponge effective? Will he come back? Will he recommend her to his powerful friends? Or will he slander her name? The aftermath is a state of limbo, a suspension between the degradation of the night past and the uncertainty of the day to come. She might sit alone in the semi-darkness, the first grey light of dawn filtering through the drapes, and simply breathe. The performance is over. The mask is off. She is no longer the witty poet, the sublime musician, the goddess of love. She is just a woman in a wrecked room, reeking of sex and wine, counting her money and praying she hasn't contracted a death sentence. This quiet, grotesque moment is the truest reality of her life. It's the bleak, unwritten chapter that follows every romanticized tale of the glamorous Venetian courtesan. The immediate aftermath is a physical cleanup, but the true filth of the trade seeps much deeper, staining the soul. The lingering trauma of a courtesan's life was not a single, diagnosable condition, but a complex web of psychological scars, managed through a cocktail of cynical humor, emotional cauterization, and substance abuse. This was the long, slow decay that continued long after the clients had gone home and the sheets had been washed. The most fundamental scar was a profound and permanent sense of dissociation. To survive, a courtesan had to perfect the art of separating her mind from her body. Her body was the tool, the commodity, the thing that was touched, used, and paid for. Her mind, herself, was a detached observer, floating somewhere near the ceiling, watching the sordid pantomime below with cold, clinical interest. This was a necessary survival mechanism, but it came at a terrible cost. Over years, this split became permanent. She might find herself unable to experience genuine physical pleasure, even if an opportunity for a real, non-transactional relationship arose. Her body had been so thoroughly conditioned to perform pleasure that it forgot how to actually feel it. Intimacy, the very thing she sold, became alien to her. The idea of being touched without payment, without a script, could feel confusing, even threatening. The emotional numbness was her armor. After years of feigning fascination, love, and ecstasy, her ability to feel these emotions authentically began to atrophy. It was like a muscle that had been held in one position for too long. It freezes. This created a profound sense of isolation. She was surrounded by people, patrons, other courtesans, servants, but she was fundamentally alone, trapped behind a wall of her own making. Her wit and charm, the things that made her famous, became a cage. People loved the persona, the performance. No one knew or wanted to know the exhausted, cynical woman behind the mask. Her coping mechanisms were a form of slow self-destruction. Alcohol was a constant companion. Wine flowed freely during encounters to loosen up the clients, but it was also her own anesthetic, a way to dull the sharp edges of reality, to blur the faces and forget the indignities. A dependence on alcohol was almost a given, a slow, steady poisoning from within that mirrored the lead poisoning from her makeup. Opiates, in the form of laudanum, opium dissolved in alcohol, were also widely available and used to manage physical pain, to bring sleep after a long night, or simply to escape into a hazy, dreamlike state. These substances provided temporary relief, but only deepened the pit of her despair, creating a cycle of dependency that was nearly impossible to break. Dark, cynical humor was her sharpest psychological tool. With her fellow courtesans, she would mock her clients with vicious, cutting wit. They would trade stories of the patrons' physical absurdities, their intellectual pretensions, their pathetic fumblings in the dark. This humor was a way of reclaiming power, of reducing these powerful men to ridiculous comical figures in their private narratives. It was a way of saying, "You may think you have power over me, but in my story, you are the fool." This gallows humor was a vital release, a way to process the daily humiliations without completely succumbing to them. However, this cynicism bled into every aspect of her life, making it difficult to trust anyone. Every kindness was suspected of having an ulterior motive. Every compliment was scrutinized for its transactional nature. She saw the world as a marketplace of appetites, and she had been on the selling block for too long to believe in anything else. The psychological scars often manifested physically. Unexplained aches and pains, chronic fatigue, digestive issues. The body keeps the score, and her body was a ledger of every unwanted touch, every moment of fear, and every swallowed scream of disgust. The constant, low-level stress of her precarious existence wore her down, aging her faster than the years themselves. Perhaps the most tragic scar was the destruction of her sense of self-worth. Society simultaneously elevated her as a goddess of beauty and condemned her as a filthy sinner. She was an object of both desire and contempt. This bizarre duality was internalized. She might feel a flicker of pride in her professional skill, her ability to command high prices and enchant powerful men. But this was always shadowed by a deep, gnawing sense of shame, a feeling of being fundamentally unclean, a fallen woman in the eyes of God and respectable society. This internal conflict, this toggling between pride and shame, was a source of constant torment. She was a queen and she was trash, and she believed both things about herself all at once. This was the true, lingering trauma, not a single, dramatic event, but the slow, grinding erosion of her humanity, leaving behind a hollowed-out shell, exquisitely decorated but empty on the inside. The nightly dramas taking place in the palazzos and back alleys of Venice were not isolated incidents. They were the engine of a massive, city-wide ecosystem of commerce, disease, and social control. The personal trauma of the courtesan was merely the epicenter of a much larger earthquake, and its societal ripple effects shaped the city's health, economy, and legal system in profound and often perverse ways. The most immediate and devastating ripple effect was on public health. Venice in the Renaissance was a petri dish, and the sex trade was the primary vector for the lightning-fast spread of syphilis. The great pox did not respect social class. A sailor could pick it up in a foreign port, transmit it to a cheap dilume in Venice, who would then pass it to a middle-class merchant, who would give it to his wife and also to a high-class honesta, who would then share it with a senator or a visiting cardinal. It was a terrifying, invisible web of transmission that connected every level of society. The city's magistrato alla sanità was overwhelmed. They tried to implement inspections and quarantines for diseased prostitutes, but these were largely ineffective and punitive. The public health crisis fueled a thriving and deadly market for quack doctors and their miracle cures. Alchemists and charlatans sold useless amulets, herbal potions, and most famously, mercury-based treatments. The widespread use of mercury created its own public health crisis, as men and women across the city slowly poisoned themselves in a desperate attempt to cure their venereal disease. The result was a city full of people suffering from the horrifying effects of both syphilis and mercury poisoning, rotting flesh, neurological damage, madness, and death. Economically, the sex trade was not a fringe activity. It was a cornerstone of the Venetian economy. The city's government, ever pragmatic, recognized this and monetized it. Courtesans were heavily taxed, their earnings contributing a significant sum to the state's treasury. They were a major tourist attraction. Wealthy men from across Europe flocked to Venice not just for its art and architecture, but for its famous courtesans. These sex tourists poured money into the local economy, spending lavishly on the women themselves, but also on lodging, food, gondolas, and luxury goods like jewelry and silk, which they gave as gifts. An entire support industry thrived around the courtesans, the perfumers, the hairdressers, the tailors, the musicians, the jewelers. The palazzo of a successful courtesan was a microeconomy in itself, employing servants, cooks, and procuresses. The city's prosperity was, in a very real sense, built on the backs of these women. This economic dependence led to a bizarre and hypocritical legal framework. The state passed laws to regulate and control prostitutes, forcing them into certain districts or making them wear identifying markers. These laws were presented as measures to protect public morality, but their real purpose was to make the trade more orderly, more taxable, and to maintain the crucial distinction between respectable women, wives and daughters who ensured the legitimate transfer of property, and dishonorable women who were for public consumption. There were laws against prostitutes inheriting property from their clients, designed to protect the wealth of noble families from being siphoned off. The legal system was not designed to protect the women. It was designed to manage them as a valuable but dangerous public utility. The most tragic societal ripple was the fate of the next generation. Unwanted pregnancies were common, and while many were terminated, many were not. The city's orphanages, like the famous Ospedale della Pietà, where Vivaldi would later work, were filled with the illegitimate children of courtesans and their clients. These children grew up with an immense social stigma. A daughter lacking a dowry and a respectable family name had very few options. Often the only path available to her was to follow her mother into the trade, perpetuating the cycle of exploitation. A son might fare slightly better, perhaps entering a trade or the military, but the shame of his birth would follow him. This constant influx of abandoned children was a testament to the thousands of secret failed transactions happening every year. The courtesans of Venice, therefore, were not just figures of glamour and sin, They were essential cogs in a complex urban machine. They were a public health crisis, an economic engine, a legal puzzle, and a social pressure valve. The ripples of their existence touched every aspect of Venetian life, from the health of its citizens to the wealth of its government. The entire magnificent, corrupt, and brilliant edifice of the Venetian Republic was inextricably linked to the commodified bodies of these women. History is not a faithful record, it's a story told by the winners, and in the case of the Venetian courtesan, the story has been ruthlessly rewritten. The brutal, transactional reality of her life, a grim tale of disease, exploitation, and psychological trauma, has been systematically scrubbed clean, polished, and repackaged into a romantic and empowering myth. This bitter legacy is perhaps the final, most profound insult, a posthumous violation that twists her suffering into our entertainment. The process of sanitization began not long after the era itself, but it reached its zenith in the 19th century. The Romantic and Victorian eras, with their simultaneous obsession with and horror of sexuality, seized upon the figure of the courtesan. Painters like Jean-Léon Gérôme or writers like Balzac transformed her into a tragic, alluring icon. In their works, the lead makeup, the syphilis sores, and the mercury poisoning vanished. They were replaced by luminous skin, a delicate, consumptive cough, and a heart full of secret sorrow and noble sentiment. The cortigiana onesta became a symbol of dangerous, exotic femininity, a creature of pure luxury and tragic love. The cynical, hard-nosed businesswoman disappeared, and in her place stood a languid, beautiful victim waiting to be saved or mourned by a sensitive male artist. This rewriting of history served a crucial purpose. It made the exploitation palatable. It allowed society to gaze upon the image of the prostitute without confronting the uncomfortable reality of what her life entailed. The client, the man who paid for her services, was recast as a passionate lover or a noble patron of the arts. The economic transaction was erased, replaced by a grand, sweeping romance. The filth, both literal and moral, was whitewashed into an aesthetically pleasing tragedy. In the 20th and 21st centuries, this myth took on a new, even more insidious form, the courtesan as a proto-feminist icon. This is the dangerous beauty version of history, where women like Veronica Franco are portrayed as empowered pioneers, using their sexuality as a tool to achieve unprecedented freedom and influence in a man's world. This narrative is deeply seductive because it aligns with our modern desire to find heroes in the past, to see struggles for liberation everywhere. It frames the courtesan's life as a strategic choice, a clever manipulation of the patriarchy for personal gain. But this is a profound and cynical distortion. While a handful of women like Franco did achieve a remarkable degree of agency and intellectual recognition, they were the one-in-a-million exceptions. Their success was used to sell the lie, to create a fantasy that masked the miserable reality for the tens of thousands of other women who were not brilliant poets, who did not charm kings, and who died young, poor, and ravaged by disease in the back alleys of Venice. To call them empowered is to ignore the fundamental lack of choice that defined their lives. A woman who chooses prostitution because her other options are starvation, a forced marriage, or a life of drudgery in a convent is not making a free choice. She is picking the least terrible option from a menu of horrors. To celebrate her sexual freedom is to ignore that her sexuality was a product for sale, its performance dictated by the market, not by her own desire. The legacy has become a feedback loop of fantasy. We consume the romantic movies, we admire the tragic paintings, and we read the pop history books that celebrate these powerful women. We do this because the truth is too ugly, too complicated, and it implicates the systems of power that still exist today. The real legacy of the Venetian courtesan is not one of empowerment, but of the brutal efficiency of capitalism and patriarchy. It is a story about how society can create a class of people to absorb its sins, its lusts, and its diseases, and then create a beautiful story to cover up the crime. The bitterest part of this legacy is how the voices of the women themselves have been almost entirely erased, save for the rare exception like Franco. For every one of her published sonnets, there are a million unheard stories, a million silent screams, a million cynical jokes whispered between clients that were lost to history. The myth survives because the silence of the majority is mistaken for the voice of the exceptional few. The rewritten history is a comfortable lie, a beautiful tombstone placed over a mass grave. So we've journeyed through the filth and the finery, the poetry and the poison. We've seen how the horrific reality of the Venetian courtesan, a life of transactional sex, debilitating disease, and soul-crushing emotional labor, was meticulously scrubbed, polished, and mounted in the museum of our historical imagination. The story was changed from one of brutal exploitation into a romantic myth of tragic heroines, or, even more absurdly, a tale of feminist empowerment. The gritty, desperate businesswoman was replaced by a languid muse, the cynical survivor by a sexually liberated pioneer. It's a beautiful, comforting lie. But here's the final bleak punchline. This isn't history. Not really. The mechanism hasn't changed. It has just been rebranded. The core principle of the cortigiana onesta, the selling of a carefully curated, intimate performance for economic survival, is the driving engine of our modern world. It's everywhere. Look at the influencer on your social media feed, meticulously crafting a persona of effortless beauty, authentic happiness, and relatable struggles. Every post is a performance, every product placement a gift from a patron, every curated glimpse into their real life a piece of theatre designed to build a brand and sell a product. They perform intimacy with millions, creating a parasocial bond that is just as calculated and just as transactional as the witty banter in a Venetian palazzo. They are selling a fantasy of themselves, and the lead-based ceruse has been replaced by digital filters and Facetune. Look at the gig economy worker, the Uber driver, or the food delivery person forced to maintain a high rating by performing endless, smiling emotional labor for customers who see them as a disposable function, not a person. Their income, their very ability to work, depends on their successful performance of cheerful servitude. One bad review, one moment where the mask of pleasantness slips, can get them deactivated. They are selling pieces of their time and their dignity, not for gold ducats, but for digital pennies, all while being told they are independent contractors, masters of their own destiny. It's the same lie, just with a better user interface. Think about the modern corporate world where employees are expected to embody the company culture, to perform passion for their brand, to be available 24/7, to merge their personal identity with their professional function. It's the long, grinding chaos of the courtesan's night, stretched into a 40-year career. You sell your creativity, your personality, your time, the most intimate parts of you, not for a night, but for a salary and the vague promise of a pension, all while knowing you are utterly disposable. We have democratized the courtesan's trade. We are all, in some small way, performing a version of ourselves for economic survival. We are all curating a personal brand, selling our personalities, and feigning a passion we may not feel, because in our hyper-commodified world, our authentic, unpolished selves are not commercially viable. The final, uncomfortable question isn't about them, it's about us. As you consume this story, as you judge the Venetian noble for buying a fantasy, what fantasy are you buying right now? What performance are you paying for with your attention, your clicks, your data? And more importantly, what performance are you selling? History isn't a foreign country, it's a mirror, and the reflection is deeply, deeply unflattering.